Scott Sigrist. We're continuing our discussion of Eric Voegelin's Hitler and the Germans, and we're going to chapter 7 and 8, the final chapters. Before I get started, how are you guys doing with the lockdown, the coronavirus lockdown? I'm starting to feel like one of those people on the zombie movies or something where they're filming themselves, for anybody who might find the video, and, it's like day 23. Running low on supplies, haven't had a haircut in a month, toilet paper gone, and so forth. We still have toilet paper, fortunately, but in any case, hope you're doing okay out there. Hang in there, we're very close to the end of the course. Okay, so chapter 7, Voegelin has just finished with chapter 6, looking at the institutions of German society that could provide some kind of leadership in terms of representing justice for the German people. They failed to do so, right? And now in chapter 7, Voegelin is coming down to the final piece of his diagnosis of the problem of Hitler and the Germans, in particular, getting down to the fundamental dynamics of the ideological mass movement that Nazism represents, right? A lot of you, this is, I know some of you have been looking for this, okay, when is it going to get down to what's driving Nazism, and why did people more in depth? Why did people go along with this? And here it is, chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, he's going to get to the way out. He's going to look at actual people who could provide, who had the capability of providing the leadership that's been missing, representing the higher order, but were unable to for certain reasons. And then, but one great figure who does point the way out. So we're going to climb out of the abyss soon. But for now, we're still in it. And so the way Voegelin talks about the ideology that we're dealing with Nazism is in terms of a second reality, right? When you see second reality, you could in your mind think of ideology. That's what Voegelin is talking about, right? But he wants to get to understand the ideology beyond the level or beneath the level of just concepts, right? The concepts themselves, from a common sense perspective, like Sancho Panza's, they don't make sense. So why do people latch on to them? There are internal dynamics going on inside of people that move them to embrace the second reality. But there's a first reality, which is the actual real world, and then imposed upon that is the second reality. And Voegelin thinks this is a better term than ideology because ideology just suggests the ideas, the concepts. The second reality is this creation of a new world by these concepts, an imaginary new world, right? And people live in this sort of imagined world, right? And the acting as if this second reality is the first reality does real damage to the actual first reality, right? The second reality, the first reality remains; it's still there, right? But living in the second reality then is going to wreak havoc with the first reality. Okay, so one of the surprising things, perhaps, I know some of you were, one of you said you're thrown for a loop by the way Voegelin approaches this in chapter 7, um, by turning to imaginative literature, fiction. What what's going on? Um, and Voegelin indicates this in various places, but the, the basic the basic issue here is that there is no political science literature, there's no social science literature that is helpful for getting down to the root of the problem, right? First of all, the root of the problem is internal dynamics uh, rather than externalities. The externalities, the ideology itself, the second reality, this comes out of the internal dynamics, what's happening inside of people, right? And and political science, modern political science in general, is does not deal with that, uh, uh, or at least not effectively. Voegelin thinks. Much of political science today, especially in America, boils down to something that was called behavioralism. How people act. So just looking at the actions, but Voegelin says this is on the surface level. Right? We've got to get what's driving the actions. The closest that modern political science has gotten typically is psychological studies. But Voegelin thinks, he doesn't say this, but it's clearly you can gather that he thinks social psychology and the way the modern uh, modern experts think about psychology is itself superficial. It doesn't go deep enough still. Um, so, just for example, so it's not as if Hitler had some kind of anxiety disorder. I mean, you might well have, but that wouldn't explain it by itself, right? I mean, plenty of people have anxiety disorders who don't, launch a campaign of mass murder, right? So there's something more going on, right? Um, so anyway, so he turns to imaginative literature because fiction does a very good job of getting down to, um, you know, intangible qualities um, that that uh, narrative descriptions often don't uh, get to very well. And because the moderns have lost the sort of philosophical technical language of getting at those that of the kind that Plato and Aristotle used, uh, this is the best Voegelin can do in the modern literature, right? Um, kind of fiction is kind of the modern equivalent of the ancient myth. But myths were meant, they were made up stories, but they were meant to reveal truths about the human condition and so forth. Okay, so he looks at three works that he thinks are help get to the bottom of things. First, there's Cervantes' Don Quixote. Cervantes, back in the 1500s, contemporary of Shakespeare, Spanish writer. Then there's Robert Musil, his book The Man Without Qualities. He's a 20th century writer. And then Heimedo von Doderer, 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 his book The Demons, and and he's also a 20th century writer. Um, so we'll start as Voegelin did with Don Quixote. The context, the critical context, Voegelin suggests, following Cervantes, is a situation where there has been a decay of the chivalric virtues. Right, it's something you remember Burke talked about. Chivalry is dead. Right, the chivalric virtues that had sort of been a guide for medieval society a moral orientation, that is decayed, and so there is a situation in which, in this the story of Don Quixote, there's a situation in which there's been a moral breakdown. There's kind of a vacuum of moral um, substance, as Voegelin likes to use the term, right? So the key characters here are Don Quixote himself, Sancho Panza, his sidekick, right? These transformers or magicians in the cave of Montesinos, um, and then uh, all the people who kind of play along with Don Quixote because it's kind of fun. You know, he keeps having these adventures. If you've never read the book, it's my favorite book, Don Quixote. It's hilarious, but also profound. But as Don Quixote, you know, he imagines himself this knight, right, with chivalric virtues, and he goes around on knightly adventures, right? And you know, everybody realizes he's kind of out of his mind, but they play along because it's funny. Um, and so and Voegelin suggests these all represent something, or they they can illustrate certain um, character types that you see going on with ideological mass movements in modern times. So Don Quixote is one who lives in the second reality, right? He is he has this imagined world, this fantasy, the second reality, and he's living within it, right? Then there's Sancho Panza, this just an ordinary man, low social status, who you know Don Quixote names as his squire, and so Sancho Panza kind of goes along. Sancho Panza is a man of common sense. He's a very sensible, regular man of common sense, but he increasingly enters into the second reality. He finds it appealing uh, after a while, and he starts to enter in, right, to the point where he is named. Don Quixote names him governor of an island, right, which is totally made up, right. Um, so then the Transformers, the magicians in the cave of Montesino, um, they sort of represent the creators of ideology, the creators of the second reality. They transform one reality into another, right? Um, so you could say these represent, in Vogelin's analysis, kind of the radical ideologues, right? And then these people who play along, many times these are elites playing along, elite figures in Spanish society. And these, for Vogelin, stand for the decadent elites, the intellectuals, who are sort of bored with prevailing trends of thought, and they, as Vogelin says, enter into and encourage the whole tomfoolery, right? And he borrows a term from the French philosopher Pascal, uh, divertissement, which is related to the English word diversion. Um, one usage of the term diversion, we we think of it in terms of diversionary tactics, right? You try to fool someone by thinking, making them think you're over here. For example, if you're military example, you want the enemy to think you're over here, but you're actually over here, right? Um, um, in English, there's an older usage of the term diversion, which is like, you know, engaging in a pastime, playing cards, stuff like that. Um, and just a silly game that's there's no real significance, but you're just passing the time. And this is the term Vogelin uses for what these decadent intellectual elites uh, are doing. They're just playing around, but they're playing with fire. These ideas that these transformers, these magicians, these radical ideologues are coming up with are dangerous ideas. But these, you think of today's university professors who sort of promote radical ideologies. They're usually not actually, you know, really engaged in revolution or something, but they are they, in their putting this before their students are making the students activists, and well, one thing can lead to another. Um, and there's a point at which Don Quixote uh, is confronted by some people who are really concerned about what he's doing and want to um, sort of bring him back to reality. And these um, these church figures who come to him um, and try to do this are the key characters here, right? Um, and so, let's see if I can pull this up. So the canon is what they're called, and they're people who we're trying to maintain church doctrine, um, correctly. And so they come to Sancho Panza and says, this is, this is not good. This is, you're living in this false world, and then Voegelin quotes. My wife is sneaking around the background. Voegelin quotes Don Quixote, his reaction to the canon. This is page 244. So the canon, he says, basically, are you saying that none of this is true? And the canon says, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And then Don Quixote says this: why then, in my opinion, it is you that are deranged and enchanted for daring to blaspheme against an institution so universally acknowledged and so authenticated that anyone denying it, as you do, deserves the very punishment you say that you inflict on certain books when you read them and they displease you. Inquisitors, in other words, Spanish Inquisition. But in this case, they're the good guys, trying to wake Don Quixote up. And Voegelin points to this quote as an expression of a totalitarian mindset, right? Don Quixote says it's blasphemy to question my second reality, right? And anyone who denies it deserves punishment. And Voegelin says, so in the context of like modern mass movements, when people, when the ideology, the second reality, becomes socially dominant, when a lot of people start buying into it, and especially when it's backed up by authorities, people in power, right? So that they punish the blasphemy of questioning the ideology. This is the root of totalitarianism, right? The shutting down of questioning. Okay, so then you have the Cave of Montesinos illustrates for Voegelin the what he calls the destruction of reason and spirit. So we've been talking about reason and spirit, nous and pneuma, as that capacity within us, or the actual engagement in, participation in the higher reality, in the divine, right? And we're seeing the destruction of this, or at least this is Voegelin is using this story to illustrate the destruction of reason and spirit, and correspondingly, a rational discourse. Remember, the way people talk about that stuff, the language they use, right, is closely related to their experience, and with the second realities comes new ways of talking about things, right? So, so in the Cave of Montesinos, right, Quixote enters this cave, and remember that it's dark down there. They put him on this saddle, and they say it's a horse, right? And then they blindfold him, and then they do all these special effects to make him feel like he's flying, right? As we learn from Don Quixote later, they're telling him all these these stories and revealing to him secrets, right? Now, this cave of um, Montesinos, um, perhaps Quixote wants us to think of uh, Plato's cave allegory. Right? Remember, the cave allegory is the world of shadows. Um, it's the world of false understanding of reality, and he's down there in the cave, right? Cody lives in the cave, so to speak. Um, so, um, so when Cody comes out, he says, um, well, this is actually Vogelin's wording here. Um, he visits the cave of Montesino, quote, where allegedly magicians are again at work and all possible secrets are to be learned. Uh, this, um, Cody says, they're revealing secrets to me about reality that, such as I can fly, I guess, for example. Um, but he comes back with stories so fantastic that Cervantes, the author, right, the narrator, suggests that Quixote has just made them up, right? And and Voegelin says this is an important turning point in the story because for the first time, um, it appears that Quixote is acting in bad faith. He's lying. He's making stuff up. He's willfully creating second a second reality of his own, um, uh, and knowingly making stuff up. Right. Voegelin earlier had called this uh, in relation to um, Hitler and uh, the pneumopathological tendency. Remember the diseased spirit uh, as being characterized by a will to swindle, right? And all of this, again, you remember Voegelin had rooted this in the libido dominandi, the lust for domination. I want to manipulate reality. I want to control reality, dominate it through creating my own second reality and exercising control over it. Right? Then, in relation to divertissement, right, is playing around. This is illustrated by this account with Sancho Panza, acting as the governor of his island. Is brought this story about the guy who crosses the bridge. I won't go into the details, but basically, it's the same kind of paradox that um, famously presented by the philosopher Bertrand Russell, called Russell's paradox. Um, and then and then Sancho Panza basically cuts the Gordian knot, right? Well, is it this or is it this? And he just says, let the guy go through. Um, and Voegelin points out that basically um, what this signifies is that uh, uh, this kind of paradox is reducing reason to formal logic. So I presented you a logical conundrum, and it's possible to solve, right? Um, but Voegelin says, well, you don't need to, play these logic games. Just look at the reality itself, right? That cuts through all of the nonsense. I can give you a personal example from my own experience. I wrote a book called America and the Political Philosophy of Common Sense, where I looked at a couple of strains of American philosophy that understand themselves as being grounded in common sense. And I was trying to explore the nature of common sense itself. And I gave a lecture on this at Princeton, where I explained the sort of alienation from common sense um, in modern culture, and what common sense means, how it's a corrective, and so forth. And there was after I finished the speech, and the panel was done, this philosophy professor came up to me. One of the things I had said in the speech was, I was trying to make this point about uh, looking at reality itself, right? Um, that to know reality itself, there is no logical argument you can make to prove, for example, that you exist. The evidence for your existence uh, is itself, right? Um, and so if you look at Descartes, for example, I mean, he's okay. There's a logical argument going on where he says, "I think, therefore I am." The very fact that I doubt, that I can have a doubt of my existence, the very fact that that doubt exists means that I am doubting, and therefore, okay, so that's a logical argument, but it's based on the fact that he has the thought, right? Um, that's the root. That's the root of the reality. Anyway, so the professor comes up to me and says, um, "Well, I could prove that we don't exist," and he makes some logical argument. And I said, "Well, you're missing the point. I mean, the as it's basic. It's a basic principle of philosophy that you can make an argument that's logically valid but false, right? If the premise is false, right? So, and that's the way it is with all of these ideologies, right? They can have very sound logic within the parameters of the ideology. It can totally make sense logically in the sense that one thing follows from another. But if the premise is false, then the statement is the ideology is false, even though it's logically coherent internally, right? Um, and what is the premise? The premise is a statement about reality, right? So how would you know whether the premise is true or not? Well, you have to measure it against. My daughter's making noise down there. You have to measure the premise against reality. You have to look at reality and says, is the premise true? Right? And the only way you can do that is by looking at the reality. Anyway, so this philosopher professor was playing around. I was trying to make a serious point about getting in touch with reality, and he's playing these logic games. So, and what's underneath this? These intellectuals playing around, and in particular here, the critical factor is that they are facilitating these radical ideologies by playing around with them, right? And Voegelin says, essentially, this is a product of boredom, right? They're bored with the way people in their society think. They're bored with all the philosophical trends, trendy new ideas that have come through, and so they want something to sort of fill their time, right? The intellectual card playing. But he says, beneath the boredom, this boredom is a symptom of something deeper, and specifically, it's a symptom of existential emptiness. I mean, something's missing in those professors that make them bored with life, right? And this is the significance of Musil's book, The Man Without Qualities, right? In Musil's book, there's this character that follows through the stories who is one of these bored intellectuals, right? And he plays around with radical ideas just because I have nothing else to do, and it's sort of fun to do this. But Musil calls him the man without qualities because there's no inner substance grounding him, right? He just plays a lot of different social roles. Today I'm going to try on existentialism. Tomorrow I'm going to try on, communism or whatever it might be, right? But there's no groundedness to any of these roles he's playing, right? And um, and what's underneath this, Voegelin says, is this character does not love himself because there is no self to love, right? He's empty inside. And you could add that for the same reason he can't love others, right? So these these bored intellectuals playing around with radical ideas, uh, they do this because uh, they lack uh, real substance within, right? Um, then Doderer, with his book The Demons, helps Voegelin with these concepts of second reality, this concept of second reality, a worldview, ideology, um, and, and there are certain specific factors uh, Voegelin highlights. One is that the second reality, what is the motive of the second reality? The second reality, and here you're talking about the magician, the creator of the ideologies. The second reality is an attempt, Voegelin says, to have the beyond in this life, to, um, to bring heaven down to earth, right? And to have sort of a utopia, right? And elsewhere, Voegelin calls this immanentizing the eschaton. I can't remember if I've used that term for you guys, but Christian eschaton, the end to which all history is moving, right? And that's where we get the term eschatology from, if you're familiar with Christian theology at all. The eschaton is the end and beyond. Okay, history is moving somewhere. The city of God is moving somewhere through history. We don't know exactly how. We don't know exactly what it's like, where we end up, but it's beyond this world. And immanence, spelled I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, immanent. There's other spellings mean different things, right? But the one with an A, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, means this worldly, right? So immanentizing the eschaton means bringing the end of history, that ultimate destination of heaven, down to this earth. So in other words, the second reality is creating a kind of imagined utopia, right? Utopia, the word means, by the way, it means nowhere. That's the literal meaning of utopia. Related to this comes arbitrary reductions of reality. Okay, but if you're going to create a world like this, that you know fully, so that you can say, I figured reality out, and you can control, manipulate, you have to reduce reality to do that. You have to cut certain things out of the actual real world, the first reality, to get your second reality, right? And Voegelin gives an interesting illustration for this of like a tank slit. So, you know, the old-fashioned tanks, you know, like they used in World War II, they'd have this narrow window, right? Tank slit where you could look out ahead of the tank. He says, embracing a second ideology is as if you're looking at that slit in the tank and think that's all there is. Like, that's the sum total reality, what you see through the slit. So all the stuff around it is cut off. Now, if you follow that analogy, you say, well, you'd be in real trouble on the battlefield if you assumed that if the enemy's not in that slit, you know, then he's not there. Right? If you thought that was everything, you'd be in big trouble. He may be over here, shoot you, you know, or whatever, right? So, so there's a reductionism to second reality. To get one, you have to cut off a bunch of the actual reality, and therefore, you know, it's a lie, right? I like to use the example or the illustration of a Greek myth, the myth of Procrustes, Procrust, Procrustes, and his obsession with his guest bed. So, you know, culture and much of the medieval world, not the medieval world, the Mediterranean world, that if a stranger comes through town, you invite him in, you have dinner, you let them stay the night, or whatever. Hospitality. It was a hospitality culture. Well, Procrustes had this obsession about his guest bed, which was that people needed to fit the bed exactly, right? He wanted them to fit the bed exactly. And so if he had a tall guest and his feet hung over the bed a little bit, he'd come in at night, cut off the feet, right? The guy sleeping. Or if they're too short, right, he'll put them on the rack and stretch their bodies out until they fit the bed, right? I think this is a beautiful illustration of what Voegelin means by the second reality, what it means to have a closed ideology, right? A system. You have to do violence to reality to get it. You have to pretend that reality fits into this system, and it's the opposite of being scientific. So, so when Marx says he's scientific materialism and so forth, but he refuses to consider problems with his theory, right, that are presented by facts in the real world. He is trying to make the facts fit his theory rather than to build his theory upon the facts, right? So there's immanentizing of the eschaton, bringing heaven to earth, right? Utopian thinking. This requires a reduction of reality, and why does somebody do this? All right, it's a fantasy. It's an escape. It's an escape from the real world that is difficult to handle. The real world is difficult to handle. There's a lot of problems, and they seem intractable. So somebody who wants to escape, if the desire is strong enough, they create this fantasy world, right? And this includes, here's the specifically perverse swindle aspect, right? It's what Voegelin calls a deliberate desire not to understand. Deliberate, right? I'm deliberately cutting off all those parts of reality that I don't like, just because I don't like them, right? And so that's why it's a swindle. Then there is this, and he's basing all this on, he's getting all this from Doder's book, from this fictional work, The Demons. And there's there's somebody like this. There's an ideologue in the story who has created this fantasy world, and somebody points out problems with it, right? And he gets enraged, and Voegelin says this is a manifestation. This is what happens when people question the ideology, right? Outburst of rage can occur. He says, if the concupiscent fantasy is disappointing. Concupiscence is a very old-fashioned word for lust, right? So if this lust to control reality, to dominate reality, is disappointed, if this fantasy is disappointed, rage can break out. The person becomes dangerous. So you can think of, for example, if with the Nazis, right, the heaven on earth for them is the Third Reich, right? This is the utopian ideal, and they want to move to, to achieve this utopia, and anyone in the way, right, has to be gotten rid of. In fact, it ends up being built into the theory, right? The Jews. The Jews are what's keeping us from this paradise, right? So they have to be eliminated. But Voegelin says, okay, so when you're dealing with this kind of thing, this crazy, I mean, the second reality is, again, with men of common sense, like Sancho Panza, just happens upon this kind of thing. This is insane. It makes no sense, right? And you can think of all kinds of reasons why. It's if you have any, intelligence, more intelligence probably than Sancho Panza. And so Voegelin says, um, it's a farce, right? And you have to talk about it as if it's a farce, um, because I mean you can't reason with people who are in this because the problem is not logical; it's spiritual. The problem is internal. It's these dynamics of wanting to control reality so that I can feel good about um, myself in a situation that I can't control, right? Not really control, but I'm trying to control it through the establishment of the second reality, right? Um, and so he gives this example about the concentration camps, right? Um, and this is a this is a truth that is stranger than fiction. This is the kind of thing that people would find hard to believe if they didn't see it with their own eyes. So, we have photographs and stuff like that, and we can, we have all kinds of documentary records from the Nazis themselves, about what went on and so forth. And this is, you have all these Holocaust deniers today. It just seems so bizarre. How could this could never happen? Well, it did happen, right? And we have the evidence of it. Um, but when the truth is stranger than fiction, right? Um, well, it got that way. The truth got stranger than fiction because the people living in a fiction, right, in the second reality. Um, but when you're dealing with people living in the second reality and doing the kinds of things they were doing in the second reality, right? Um, you, you can't really talk about it in rational terms. You have to get down to the irrationality that's driving the thing, right? You have to treat it like farce, right? Um, and that's one of the reasons that fiction is very helpful here. Like these novels. Um, so then Voegelin kind of comes down to brass tacks, a conclusion about the nature of the revolutionary, the nature of these radical activists who embrace the second reality and try to live in the second reality. And here he's relying still on Doderer. Um, and so a revolutionary. This is a quote from Doderer. A revolutionary is someone who wants to change the general situation or change reality, right? Not just a particular like practical problem, but reality. He wants to change the general situation because of the impossibility or untenability of his own position. He is not coping with real life, right? Therefore, he wants to change reality, make it something different, wish the first reality away, right? Um, so again, Doderer, uh, his the he has been able unable, this person, creator of the second reality, he's been unable to endure himself, and so now others have to endure him. Right? He is imposing himself on the world, therefore on all of these people. Right? Why is he doing this? Because he can't live with himself. He can't live with the difficulties of his life. The revolutionary wants to forget about what Doderer calls, quote, the highly concrete task of his own life. Right? I mean, getting your crap in order, it takes work. Right? It's not easy. When life is difficult, uh, rolling up your sleeves and actually dealing with the problems, especially the internal problems. You know, what's wrong with me? That is uncomfortable. That is difficult. It is highly concrete and specific, right? Um, and you can't solve those problems through a second reality. These fantasies, right? That only prevents you from dealing with the problem and creates new, worse problems. Um, but the, the revolutionary, the nature of the revolutionary is he wants to escape this hard work of getting his own crap in order, right? And and live in the second reality. Um, so if he's going to forget the concrete task of his own life, he's got to systematically falsify anything that reminds him of that, right? Another way you can put this is, okay, so why do people make up second realities, or why do people embrace them? A second reality somebody else has made up. Because, one, they're very dissatisfied with life. That's normal. All of us are dissatisfied with certain things in life, right? But after that, the steps are not normal. They can't cope with the uncertainties of life and the difficulties of life. And to overcome that, they try to create a reality that is certain. So one of the driving factors of establishing a second reality is to achieve certainty. To achieve certainty, you have to deliberately not look at all of the uncertainties of life, right? So it's a will to certainty and a will to control life, right? Which has gotten unmanageable, and you are not willing to face it, right? So that's fundamental, and this is this move, this thrust to create the second reality and live in the second reality. The root of that, Voegelin says, is this libido dominandi, this will to domination over reality itself, right? Okay, so that gets at the. I should say one more thing: is that will to dominate is kind of effectively playing God, right? We didn't make the world. We didn't make the world we were born into, right? And we can't remake the world, literally transform the world, right? There are fundamental elements of existence that we live, for example, as Voegelin likes to stress, in the in-between, right? You think of the golden cord image, we are drawn to higher things, but we're also pulled downward to lower things by our steely cords of passion, right? We can't escape that. We can't escape that either direction. You might try to escape it through some sort of radical mysticism, where like the Manichaeans, ancient Manichaeans, and the Gnostics, where they said, well, the material world is evil, right? And so I must escape into the spirit, the spiritual world. Or conversely, to reject the existence of any kind of spiritual world, any higher reality, and to make the material world the only world. The fact is, this structure of human existence cannot be destroyed, right? There is a structure of reality that we didn't make, that we can't control, right? That is what it means by trying to transform reality, denying the structure of reality. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's not talking about changing practical problems, changing society for the better by solving some practical problems, right? It's his effort to dominate reality, to transform it like a magician into something else, right? Okay, that's enough for chapter 7. Chapter 8, we begin to see the light coming into the cave, maybe the way out of the cave, okay? All right, I'll talk to you then.